Hello there, I didn't know you were there. Are you back to hear more about early photography? Well, I can tell you some more things. This is part 4 in my contribution to CoCoVid. CoCoVid is a 4-day long conference that the Costube community has been hosting in response to Costume College's cancellation this year. We're putting together a ton of informational and educational videos as well as some Instagram and Discord live events. It's been hosted from July 30th to August 2nd, 2020, but if you're watching this in the future, a lot of these videos will remain on our YouTube channels, and I have linked the program in the description below. Go check it out. I've linked all kinds of things in the description below, so I recommend checking it out after you watch this video. If as part of this CoCoVid weekend you are participating in the badge collection program, I will have the code for this badge at some point in my video, so stay tuned. In my first video, I told you all about daguerreotypes. In the second video, it was all about ambrotypes, tintypes, and wet plate collodion. Yesterday, my video was all about cased images, magic lanterns, and a photo process that you can try at home. In this last video, I am going to be talking about early paper photographs. There were a few earlier ones, but this is the first commercially successful paper photograph. In 1850, Frenchman Louis Desiré Blancart Everard invented the albumen print. It's a silver chloride process that uses negatives to make positives. Albumen process uses egg whites, hence the name. To make an albumen print, you take a piece of paper and float it in a solution of albumen and a few other things. Let it dry. For a richer and more permanent image, you do a second coat, but in between the two coats, you do another step to harden the first layer, letting it dry before you do the second coat. After you've done that second coat and let it dry again, then you sensitize the image by floating it on a solution of silver nitrate. Following that, there's an optional step of fuming it with ammonia to make it more sensitive and increase density and shadow contrast. After all that, you're ready to make a print, provided you have a negative. The negatives at this time were still wet plate collodion images. They're a lot like an ambrotype. Here's an ambrotype. Here's a wet plate negative. So they're very similar, except the negative is exposed for longer and has an additional step to increase the density and contrast for a better print. Then the negative and the paper were put into a split back contact printing frame. My contact printing frame is stuck at the Photographic Center Northwest along with all my darkroom stuff, but it's basically like a picture frame, but instead of the glass, you put the negative, then you put the paper, and then the back of the frame has a hinge split so that you can open it up and check how your print is coming along without the whole thing moving and losing registration. Albumen prints are exposed with UV light. Historically it was done with the sun, but most photographers today who do any sort of process using UV light make a UV light box because it's a lot more consistent and controlled. All of my prints I've made with albumen prints are done using just the sun because I did them all with John Coffer and he teaches stuff in the traditional manner. All of my prints that I've made took a few minutes in full bright sunlight to expose. Albumen is a printing out paper, unlike darkroom paper, which is a developing out paper. Printing out papers, you can see the image as it is being printed, whereas developing out images, the paper looks like it's still blank until it develops and then the image appears. With printing out papers, like albumen prints, you can check how it's coming along as you're printing it. Doing this allows you to see when you have hit the right exposure time, and then you can go and develop it. Albumen prints are contact prints, so that means the negative is in direct contact with the paper. You put emulsion side of the negative to emulsion side of the paper. Doing this, you flip the image over, and so the images are no longer backwards like in daguerreotype and tintypes. Also, in contact printing, the size of the image is directly related to the size of the negative. You can't make it any bigger, unlike in the darkroom where you put a film in the enlarger and you can enlarge the image as big as you want. With contact printing, you need to shoot the actual negative the size that you want the print to be. After you've exposed your print, you then go and develop it. It takes a lot of trays, 9 in total. You gotta wash it a bunch and develop it, fix it, all that. You also gold tone it, which gives it a nice red to reddish brown tone. The cheapest albumen prints weren't gold toned, and so they faded to more of a yellow. Gold toning helps with the archivability of this print. Once you've worked your way through those 9 prints, then you flatten it and dry it. All done, right? You got your albumen print. Nope, not done yet. Then you have to cut it out and mount it onto the card that it's gonna finally live on. Easy, right? You can see why no one really does this process anymore. Back in the heyday when this was like the photographic process that was pretty much your only option for good reproducible prints, photo studios would like be all set up for this and have a production line and probably some assistants to help process it through so it wasn't such a big deal. The image itself is embedded in the albumin and chemicals on the surface of the paper versus being in the paper itself, like some other processes where the chemicals soak into the paper. I feel like I've said this about every process I've talked about, but because the image is on the surface of the paper in the chemicals, it provides so much detail. It's really amazing. Looking at this print in the plane of focus here, I can see all the pieces of grass and all the little flowers. I can see the grain of the wood on this tongue of this farm equipment. It's amazing. I don't know what more to say about early photography than the detail. Now that you have an overview of how the process works, let's talk about the 3 most common ways that you will see it. Carte visites, cabinet cards, and Stereocards. Carte visites were introduced in 1854 in France, but didn't really gain popularity for a few years. They were mainly popular between 1860 and 1880. Back in the Victorian time, calling cards were very popular. You would go and visit someone and leave behind a card with your name on it so that they knew that you visited, or they could put them in an album and like collect all the cards of their friends. Enter photography. Now you can put your photograph on your card and leave that behind too. Hence the name Carte visite, which translates to visiting card. Today we shorten the name often to CDV, but it seems like that's a 20th century abbreviation. But I'm going to use the abbreviation CDV now because YouTube subtitles keeps thinking I'm saying cartoon physique instead of carte de visite. The cards came in a size of 2.5 inches by 4.25 or 4.5 inches. They were cheaper than the earlier processes. They were about 15 cents a shot versus a couple dollars of daguerreotypes. Unlike tintypes, daguerreotypes, and ambrotypes, which were a one-off, you have it and you can't reproduce it, because the CDVs were made from a negative, you were able to make as many prints as you wanted to from one sitting. Now you could send all your friends a photo of yourself. They also started producing cards with photos of famous people so that you could collect them. Photo albums also came into popularity at this time. This is one that I have for carte visites. It opens on a hinge. It's pretty worn, as you can see. I'm not sure what year it's from. It's got very large, thick pages where you can slide in different images. This one has quite a few in it. It's got a lot of different styles, a lot of pictures. I think it must be from the Midwest somewhere. A lot of them are from Minnesota. A lot of good hairstyles in this collection of people. The front of CDVs often has the photographer's name on it, and then on the back are often quite intricate advertisements for the photographer. Oftentimes they'll have the address of the photographer, which is pretty fun to look up. This one's a photographer in Iowa. This one is for a woman photographer in Minneapolis. Sometimes the photographs have gold borders around the images, and other times they're just plain. Sometimes the advertisements are a lot more plain, and sometimes they're just blank on the back. So that's the carte de visite. Next up is the cabinet card. Can you believe I only have one actual cabinet card in my collection? I have this one, which is the same size, but it's dated 1902, and I think it's a different photo process. I gotta get some more. They're just like carte de visites, except for bigger. They're called cabinet cards because they are big enough to be put in a cabinet. You can see them from a distance, so you can just put them in your cabinet and look at them from there. They were introduced in 1866, but their main popularity was from 1878 to 1898. By the 1880s, dry plate came into use. Dry plate's a lot like wet plate, except for you don't have to prep the plate right when you're going to use it. They can be prepped or bought ahead of time and then just stored for a while and shoot it when you're ready. And then after you've shot it, you can put it away and then develop it later. This made it a lot easier for like travel photography. Didn't have to lug a dark box or dark tent with you and all your chemicals. By this time, people are also getting a lot more comfortable with getting their photograph taken. Advancements in the photo process, the lenses, and the cameras has really reduced the exposure time down a 60th of a second now instead of seconds or minute. Head braces are no longer necessary. Photographs are also a lot cheaper, and people are more relaxed taking them, so there's some more goofy ones as this time goes on. Still a lot of standard portrait, but people do start to relax a little bit more. Again, often they would have the photographer's information on the bottom of the card and on the back an advertisement for the photographer. Cabinet cards are 4¼ by 6¼ inches in size. It is also popular to put them in albums. This is one I have for cabinet cards. It's got a velvet cover with this sort of plasticky decoration that is starting to flake off. The latch is very ornate. Unfortunately, it doesn't actually have any photographs in it, but cabinet cards can fit in here. It does have a section in the back for carte visites or tintypes. It did come with one tintype, but it's a very pretty album. I imagine it was a lot of fun before TV or radios to pull out your photo album and look at all your friends and family. You can find CDVs and cabinet cards easily. There are a lot at antique stores, thrift stores. You can find them online, any of those sales places very easily. They're often mislabeled, but now you know the difference between a CDV and a cabinet card, so when you see them mislabeled, you'll be like, guys, you got that wrong. Although store employees don't really seem to be that impressed when you tell them that they got it backwards. They're very handy for costumers to look at. The detail in these photographs can be great, so you can really see what kind of weave their clothes are made out of. You can see the details of the buttons quite often. You get really good ideas for how their hair is done, how his tie is tied. Get good ideas for poses. Highly worth checking all these out. People's hairstyles back then, they were so weird. A good book about 19th century paper photographs is this quick guide made by the same guy who wrote a book I recommended yesterday. It's the only one I've seen about how to date cabinet cards and carte visites, but it's got a lot of information, and again, he has a lot of really good photographs that he's printed in here. It's got some history of photography as a whole, and it talks about cabinet cards, carte visites all the way through. He's made a whole series of books. He has one on real photo postcards and another on photo restoration and archive photography. I only have got copies of these two, but his other ones sound pretty interesting as well. Ribbon badge. So that's 19th century portraits. Can you believe I haven't even gotten into 20th century yet? I haven't even gotten to film? But I'm just going to talk about Victorian era because otherwise we'll be here forever. Plus it's the era that I know the best. There's something else though that I want to talk about that was really popular in the 19th century and continued on into the early 20th century. Stereocards. Stereocards look like this. They're shot in a camera that has two lenses that are about eye width apart. This provides a slightly different perspective between the two images, and so when you look at them as one, it becomes 3D. The negatives look like this. It has the same image twice, but with slightly different perspective. Stereotypes have been popular for a while. There were stereo daguerreotypes that were in a special case that the case would turn into a viewing mechanism for it. But when albumin printing and the cheap reproduction of images became popular, they really took off. The easiest way to view them is with a stereoscope. The stereo card goes into this little holder here. Then you put it up to your face and slide this back and forth until the image comes into focus in 3D. You can find a lot of different types of stereoscopes. This one is a very simple one, but it's a Holmes type model, which is the most common I have found. It's got a little handle that folds up and down for easy storage. They did also come in like a large furniture type of piece, but this is a very typical example of the kind that people would have. They did have more ornate versions too, with like embossed metal and then like velvet around here. This one is a very cheap plain version. In giving demonstrations and talks on early photography, I found that a lot of people today, this doesn't fit their face very well, the antique ones, but there are modern versions that are bigger, so if you got a big head, maybe go get one of the modern kit versions to put together yourself. I think that Stereocards are an overlooked but very beneficial resource for costumers to use. Like magic lantern slides, they often made educational series of Stereocards, so you can get good views of different places around the world. Here's Venice. You can get better ideas of like what people wore on the street versus in the studio when they're getting a portrait made. Yes, I'm sure some of them were still staged, but they're very interesting to look at all the same. I specifically like to collect ones that are of Scotland or the Pacific Northwest of America, although really, I like to collect them all. I really love this one of Princes Street in Edinburgh because it shows what the streets looked like, what sort of vehicles were on the road, and how people were dressed. I also love this one of two women sitting outside of their cottage, drinking tea. Like, why are there so many chairs outside? Stereocards were often labeled with a title that is on one side. When you view them in the stereoscope, it doesn't need to be on both sides because you can just see that one sort of transposed over the image. Oftentimes too, they had a bunch of text on the back telling you about what is going on in the image or telling you a story. The text is often with a Victorian and Edwardian mindset in view, so not always the way we would talk about people today. It was also very popular to have studios set up shots of scenes that would tell a story. There would oftentimes be multiple Stereocards in a sequence that you would like go through and it would tell a whole story. Some of these have good shots of clothing or hair, like this one titled, "We Know Who He Is." This one of bathing bells has some great bathing costumes. You can clearly see that they're all wearing corsets with them. However, they're also very short, which makes me wonder if they actually wore this or if it's actually part of the category of more risque Stereocards, which there are a lot of. I think the risque Stereocards are fascinating because they give you a glimpse into what people wore underneath their clothes that you typically see. This peeping Tom one is great because you can see a lot of the layers that the woman is wearing. She's also busting a corset myth that I hate, that you have to put on your shoes before your corset. You can put your shoes on after your corset, it's not that hard. You can also see her room, see the chamber pot under the bed. She totally knows that the guy is there and is putting on us. I don't know who he thinks he's fooling. This one is a two-parter. It's also great. You get a good shot of the corset, which is thrown over the end of the bed. Some of the highlights are blown out, but you can see their nightclothes, stocking, and stockings. It's pretty interesting. Here's the second part that I have. Get that man. There are also just a lot of really weird cards. I don't know what's going on in this one. There was I think it was part of a series because I have another one that's set up very similarly except for she's spanking one of the boys. But you get a good view of people's clothes. As I mentioned, there's a lot of travel ones. It's interesting to see some shots from around the world. Here is Mount Fuji. This one of Scotland, you can see some nice details on the back of her top. It's also very popular to have ones that told biblical stories or other stories made with little models. In the heyday of Stereocards in large towns, you could go and rent a stereoscope and Stereocards. I think it must have just been a lot of fun to hang out before there was TV or radios and get transported around the world. I still think they're a lot of fun to look at and get brought back to the past. One thing that's pretty cool about Stereocards is oftentimes they're dated. Like this one has a copyright of 1896 on the bottom there, or oftentimes they're also printed in the image, like this one here has a copyright of 1900. Makes it a lot easier to date when they're from, but not all of them are dated. Stereocards are still really easy to find, again at thrift stores or antique stores or online. Brian May of Queen fame is super into Stereocards and has started the London Stereoscopic Company, and he has reproduced a bunch of books of collections of Stereocards, including a collection by the photographer, our buddy George Washington Wilson, the Magic Lantern St. Kilda series. He also did a lot of stereo images, I suppose. Brian May has also reproduced a book of his images. He also has a collection that he gathered that's all this one village that was photographed through the years. By now, you might be aware that I'm a big fan of obscure societies to join, and one that I really like is the National Stereoscopic Association. It's all about 3D images through the eras, not just Stereocards. But they have a magazine that comes out every other month called Stereo World. It has a lot of articles, and they reproduce Stereocards in the right size. When you join, they send you a little viewer so that you can, to help you view the images in 3D. They have lots of different articles that are very fascinating. They have a convention every year. This year it's online and it's in a couple weekends. I think I might try to go. But you can see there's just a lot of weird stereo images out there. They're pretty fun. And again, the detail is there so you can actually see what is going on, and ones that haven't faded too much. I love albumin prints. They're beautiful. People in the costuming community often talk about their dream Worth gown. Worth was a famous designer in the Victorian era and into the Edwardian. Go check out Kathy Hayes' videos if you want to learn about him. But in the costuming world, people are always like, this is my dream Worth, and it's like a big gown that they want to reproduce. I don't have one, but my dream Worth to shoot mammoth albumin prints. Again, because the negative has to be the same size as the print that you want to make. My dream is to get a camera that can shoot 16 by 20 or 20 by 24 inch plates, to shoot glass negatives that size, and to make albumin prints from them. It would be so beautiful. But that's a dream that hopefully one day I will achieve. But in the meantime, I'm gonna just try to get to where I can print my own albumin prints at home. I gotta build my darkroom shed first, and my dream is within like 3 years to sew an 1880s outfit and shoot myself a cabinet card. Maybe an 1870s outfit too, and do some CDVs. If you're like, I really want to make some albumin prints, a manual that I recommend is the John Coffer's Doer Guide. It's very extensive and tells you all how to do wet plate and albumin printing. It's the only manual that I recommend, honestly, and comes with a DVD set. You just gotta go to his website and write him a letter with a check, because that's how he does things, and then he'll send it to you in the mail. Highly worth it. Really the best manual in these processes to get. Covers ambrotypes, tintypes, and albumin printing. So that's about what I gotta say about Victorian photography. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you learned some things. I'm gonna be getting back into my regular sewing content coming up. I've got some videos in the log almost ready to go, including an Edwardian bathing costume and bathing boots. I've got the reveal of my sewing studio that I've been building once I finish building it, and a process video on how I built a sewing studio from the ground up. Then I also have the announcement for the big project that I'm going to work on next coming up, as well as all the pieces into that. Spoiler alert, it's an Edwardian motoring outfit. So please stick around and hit subscribe, leave me a comment. I love reading them. Go check out the rest of the CoCoVid videos, and if you missed any of my other videos on early photography, I put them all in a playlist for you. Thanks for coming by. Were you curious about some of these things behind me? Let me tell you about them. This is a camera that was my husband's great-grandparents'. I'm not sure if it's the same great-grandparents whose wedding rings we have, but I gotta fact check that. It's from 1914. This is one of my Brownie cameras. It's from 1902. I use it for wet plate sometimes, so it's covered in silver nitrate. This is a pair of binoculars as a wedding gift to my parents. Just some cool old books. Antique lens. This is my first antique lens. It's super big. Lenses back in this era didn't have shutters, and so you couldn't change the aperture. In order to do that, there's Waterhouse stops, which would slide into this slot. It's like a little card with a hole in it, and you slide it in there. I will talk about it more in my video where I demonstrate wet plate and shoot myself a portrait. There's also no shutter, as I just said, so the lens cap is used as the shutter. And then this is my other antique lens. It has a patent date of June 30th, 1868. So in 2018, I threw it a 150th birthday party and baked it a cake, because that's the kind of person I am. This lens and this lens both shoot the same size. Can you believe that? They both shoot whole plates. This is my 4x5 camera. I've got an Intrepid. It's what I used to shoot that demonstration of how cameras record things backwards. And then I got some Hungarian Society annuals.